So here we find ourselves in our very last session of Job. You guys seem to be alive and sitting upright, so we're going to call this a win. And I am just so grateful for you guys. I'm grateful that you're willing to come on this journey with me, the steep uphill climb. And what I talked about on session 1, which was this study has been for me a steep upward climb. Some of you might have been like, well, I'm not really sure what you mean by that, but now that we make it to the very end, and as you've done your homework throughout the last weeks, you may understand what I mean by the steep upward climb. Now, this is my hope for this session, is that as we're making sort of our final ascent, that we will round the bend and we will catch sight of God in a way that stops us in our tracks. And what I'm going to encourage us to do, myself included, is to stop and to behold. So as we round the bend and we catch just a glimpse of who he is, we want to stop and soak who he is into us. And seeing the grandeur of God, there's nothing better than that. And so I'm going to ask him to come and to do that with us and for us. So God, I just am so grateful. It's with much gratitude in my heart that I stand here with my sisters to say thank you for who you are. Thank you for your faithfulness to us. Thank you that we are at the end of this journey that we've gotten to take together. And I pray that we can look back on all you have done. God, I want to be a different person after encountering you in the book of Job. I am a different person after that. And I pray that for my sisters and my friends, that this is what is true. We see you differently. So God, would you come now in the next 30 minutes, and would you reveal yourself to us? Would you pull back the curtain and let some of your glory shine on us and hit our eyeballs in a way that maybe it hasn't before? And so I pray this in Christ. Amen. So my husband, Jared, received his first tattoo on his back 5 or 6 or 10 years ago. And it was a cross, and it was right in the middle of his back. And he came home from getting his tattoo, and he had this tattoo, they call it tattoo goo. It's an ointment that you put on the tattoo maybe twice a day. And so he had me putting on this ointment on his back, on the tattoo. And maybe it had been 24 hours, maybe a little bit longer. And I started to notice that the tattoo was looking funny. And so I thought, well, the problem is I'm not putting enough ointment on it. And so I'm just going to double up my efforts on the ointment. And so I was like, hey, babe, let's start really soaking that ointment on there, because something weird and wacky's happened back here. Well, within probably 3 or 4 days, his back, where the tattoo was, looked like welts were just coming up out of his tattoo. And he came home and he was like, this is so painful, like something's wrong. And so he went back to the tattoo guy, and he came back home, Jared came back home, and he was like, well, the tattoo artist said, obviously I am allergic to the ointment. And I was like, well, that wasn't as obvious to me. Now, here's why. I had diagnosed the wrong problem, therefore I had come to the wrong solution. So I had diagnosed the problem as not enough tattoo ointment, and therefore my solution in my head was, I'm just gonna amp up my efforts. And that doesn't work. When we come to the wrong, defining the problem the wrong way, we will never end up with the right solution. It always will lead to the wrong outcome. Think of it this way. So say we've gone to the doctor and we're having breathing problems, and the doctor says, you have asthma, and I'm gonna give you an inhaler. So he's diagnosed the problem, and the solution is an inhaler. But say that your breathing problem is not actually asthma, it's pneumonia. The inhaler will never work to fix pneumonia. you need an antibiotic. So the wrong problem identified equals the wrong solution. And so let's look at this. Here we have, we must identify the correct problem before we can reach the correct solution. We must identify the correct problem before we can reach the correct solution. So we have our friend Job that we have left in the midst of his suffering and misery. Now, if we think about Job, if Job had to identify his problem, what one word do we think he would use to identify his problem? It wouldn't take me long to think, I bet Job would say suffering is his problem, that he was fine and dandy until the day he lost everything, till the day he lost his children, to the day he lost his health. He was fine. Then suffering comes and hits him like a brick. And this is the problem. This is what Job would say. I have a feeling if we could have asked him. Now, our question is, would God diagnose Job's problem as suffering? What did God believe Job's problem to be? Because Job says, suffering's my problem. Therefore, the solution is, God, you need to show up and give me answers. That's the solution that I need to my problem, to fix what's wrong. And so we want to say, okay, well, is that what God's going to do? Is he going to come and show up and give Job all the answers why he has suffered for these many months? Now, remember our fourth friend Elihu, who had come, and he had told Job two things. One, God is not silent. God speaks through suffering. And number two, God is not against you. God is actually for you and your restoration. Now, another reason I believe that Elihu actually was speaking from God is because when Elihu gets done with his 6 chapters, at the very end of him talking to Job, that very last chapter, he seems to anticipate and see God coming, because he starts talking like this. Elihu starts saying, Job, can you hear him? Can you see him? Listen to the sound of his majestic voice. It rumbles like thunder. And it's as if Elihu could see God coming in the storm at a distance, and he's prepping Job. He's saying, here he comes, get ready. The God of all glory is coming to speak to you. And when I got to chapter 38, which is where God comes, and when he speaks, I thought, finally, after all this arguing, all this suffering, all this depression, finally we're going to get some answers of what happened. What is God going to say about Job's suffering? What is God going to say about why bad things happen to good people? It's going to be in here. So I flipped open the book to chapter 38, so eager to get in and to spend hours and study with it. And so as I opened to chapter 38 and began reading through chapter 38, chapter 39, and 40, I would see, okay, so God's talking about morning stars singing. Well, I didn't think he'd go off in that direction, but okay. So there is the sea, and then there's some snow. Bear cubs, okay. Now there's an ostrich laying an egg, and it's foolish. Then I get to the very end where he's like wrapping up, and I'm like, okay, surely it's going to be in this chapter. And it's all about a creature called the Leviathan, a strange dragon-like powerful creature. And then God is finished. And I'm like, God, did you hear what Job was asking you? Because that was bizarre. You came to him and you told him about ravens and ostriches and bear cubs. Did you not understand what Job's problem was? What did that have anything to do with Job sitting on the outskirts of town with boils from head to toe, rejected by everyone, and suffering. Now, here's the thing. If Job's problem, or if a problem was, let's say, skin cancer, okay? So a problem crops up on the skin, and instead, we put Neosporin and a Band-Aid over it, right? But what it needs is removal by surgery and radiation, right? Because when we have cancer, it needs to be removed and radiated. And here's what God was not willing to do. God was not willing to look at that on Job and give him a Band-Aid to cover it. God was willing to do removal and radiation to Job's real problem, which we're going to find out Job's real problem was not suffering. And God is about to tell us what Job's real problem was. We'll look at Job 38. This is the first thing God has to say. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. He said to Job, "Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge?" So here God comes finally, and he speaks to Job directly. Out of a tornado. Now, think of all that comes with a tornado. So here we have Job sitting on an ash heap, miserable, and God comes in a storm, a powerful storm. Think lightning, rain, wind, very loud, a scary event. Here God comes, and this is what God speaks out of the storm. Who is this that obscures? So our first interesting word is obscures, which just means to block or to hide or to darken. So God says, somebody is darkening, is hiding. Now our next question is, what's being hidden? And it's right here. It's the next two words, my plans. So God says, there's a problem here, and the problem is my plans are being blocked. Now, what are these plans being blocked by? Well, we just have to keep reading. My plans with words without knowledge. God says, I've got some plans, and the problem is there's something blocking it. And what's blocking it, Job, is what's coming out of your mouth. So God says, actually, Job, with your suffering's not the problem. The banner you have waving over your suffering, the words without knowledge, that is your problem. Words without knowledge is your problem. And God says, hang on to your hat. I'm about ready to tell you and inform you of what really is true. And God goes on to ask Job over 80 questions about creation. And so let's follow here of what God is revealing about himself to Job. God reveals to Job that creation, number one, shows God's vast and infinite power. Creation shows God's vast and infinite power. Let's see what it sounds like. So this is God speaking to Job. These are a part of some of the first questions that he asks Job. Okay, Job, where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Tell me what that day was like. Go ahead. What was that like? How did I set the earth in place? Who marked off its dimensions? Surely, Job, you know. Go ahead. What is it? Don't you love it that God is sarcastic? Let's look at the next one. And then God says, have you ever given orders to the morning or shown the dawn its place? God says, have you ever looked at the sun and said, rise, and it's risen? How many times have you done that, Job? Let's look at the next one. Now, what is the way to the abode of light? And where does darkness reside? Can you take them to their places? So, do you tell light where to go? And do you tell darkness where it can exist? Do you know their paths to their dwelling? Job, surely you know, for you were already born. You have lived so many years. What are you, 60? 65, Job? Tell me. So go ahead and let me know. And as God says this, we see that his vast power is far beyond anything we can imagine. But God's not done. He has a second thing he wants to show Job and us. Number 2, God reveals to Job that creation shows God is intimately involved with created things. So we have a God who is powerful, large, and also intimate and close. The two are astounding. He's large and powerful and intimate and close. And let's read what he has to say about himself. God says, okay, Job, do you hunt the prey for the lioness and satisfy the hunger of the lions when they crouch in their dens or lie in the thicket? Job, when the lioness gets hungry, are you the one providing the meal for them? Because I see the lion and her cubs. I see them and I provide for them. Who provides food for the raven when its young cry out to God and wander about for lack of food? So God says, as the young sit in their nest, calling out, squeaking, I, God, creator of all things, hear them. And actually, I satisfy their hunger. Job, can you do that? And this is the last one. Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you watch when the doe bears her fawn? Do you count the months until they bear? Do you know the time they will give birth? They crouch down and bring forth their young. Their labor pains are ended. So God says, Job, do you know when the mountain goats give birth? I mean, all million of them on the face of the planet. Do you name them? Do you know when her pains start? Are you there to help her give birth to her young? Can you do that, Job? Because not only am I a God of power, I am intimately involved with my creation. Every single detail does not go unnoticed by me. This is what God reveals to Job. Now, what we find here is that God is saying, when he says suffering is not your problem, this words without knowledge that's flapping over your suffering is your problem. And this lack of knowledge is not lack of information. Let's hang here for a second. It is not lack of information. Now, why wouldn't we just say, well, wouldn't it be if Job's lacking information? Maybe he just needed to know that God was big and that God was near. The problem is, Job already knew that. If you read the book of Job, you'll see that he believed firmly that God was the creator of all things. He believed God was almighty. He also believed God was close and near, because he refers back to it to say, you were kind to me, you were like my friend. So this is not new information to Job. Let's see what it is. Job's knowledge was lacking correct proportion of himself and God. This was not an information problem. This was a proportion problem. And let me show you what I mean by that. So everything goes back to a T-chart. I think they're wonderful, and it gives us a real clear, accurate view. So let's look at, if we're thinking proportion, what did Job think about himself and what did Job think about God? So we clearly see that throughout the book of Job, Job was very large in his own eyes. And here's what I mean by that. That he said, okay, God, you must give me the answer. I deserve to know why you did what you did. Now, what that means is Job inflated himself to say, my brain needs to comprehend it. I think you're wrong. And I think evidently I know more than you do. I know what should be done and should not be done. And that made Job's view of God very small. So God says here, okay, Job, your problem, these words without knowledge that you've got flapping over your suffering, this is a proportional problem. You seeing yourself as great and you seeing me as small, this is your problem. And so I'm giving you the correct solution, which is to show you who I am. And as God spoke through the storm and told Job all of what we just read, Job saw the immeasurable distance between God's power, wisdom, and plans and his own. As God spoke out of the storm, Job realized there is a massive difference between God and him. And when that happened, Job went from being great in his own eyes and God small in Job's eyes to God being great and Job being a dot. Now let's listen to what Job says, how he explains this. When God finishes speaking and takes a break in chapter 40, Job pipes up and he says this. Now picture Job in the middle of the storm. The wind is whipping around him. There is rain pouring down. There's lightning, there's thunder, and he has just heard the very words of God. And this is what he said, "Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, and I will not answer twice, but I will proceed no further." Now, Job stands there after hearing God and says, I am of small account. I spoke these words without knowledge. I'm just gonna clap my hand over my mouth and keep my mouth shut. Now, in our culture, we'd be like, Job, you need to see a counselor because really, we shouldn't say things like you're of small account. And we don't tend to like that kind of thinking. And here's what I think Job would say to us. He would give us this picture. He would say, oh, you're highly mistaken. Because what's just happened is I have stepped out on the Grand Canyon of who God is and beheld him in his glory. It is just a fact. I am of small account compared to who he is. That's just true. He would say, you don't stand on the edge of the Grand Canyon and see the immense beauty of it and need a self-esteem booster. You're not worried about yourself in that moment. Your eyes are fixed and beholding on something that is far larger than you, and it creates on the inside of you worship. And that's what happened to Job. It was not the Grand Canyon. It was the Grand Canyon of who God is. Now, so what does Job do? What does he have to say at the very end? God has finished speaking. And here's what Job says to God. I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You ask of me, God, who is this that obscures and blocks my plans with words without knowledge? That was Job's problem. Job says, surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. Things too wonderful for me to know. So here's what Job says. I had over my suffering as a banner, this words without knowledge. I have heard you come and speak to me through a storm, and now I've shut my mouth. Those words, I'm wiping them away. And instead, what I choose to put over my suffering are the words, too wonderful. Now, Job's not saying, my suffering is too wonderful. Job's saying, you, God, in my suffering are too wonderful. Now, remember, Job sits in the same set of circumstances. He is not saying, God, you're too wonderful because you restored me back to health and wealth and happiness. He's saying, God, you are too wonderful because of who you are. Now, I finished this teach, writing it, and it was late one night. And as I walked into our living room, it was dark, and this picture flashed on a screen. I caught a glimpse of it. And I had just been writing all of this, too wonderful, too wonderful, too wonderful. This is what Job walked away with. God, you're too wonderful. And I see her face, and I remember that picture. It was about 6 weeks before she died. We were at Disney. And when I see that picture, I flash back, as I'm thinking, too wonderful, I flash back to watching her casket go into the ground, and then Virginia red mud start to pour over it. And I think that moment is probably when I mentally felt the most fragile, because everything within me, what I wanted to do is like claw at the dirt, because you don't let your child go into the cold ground. It's against every instinct in you as a mother. You can't let that happen. And so I thought, could I pick up a pen and over the suffering, over that picture, could I write too wonderful? Not her passing is too wonderful, but God, you are too wonderful. Could I write that? And I thought and sat there and thought, and I wasn't asking to come up with a right answer. I wasn't asking, like as a teacher that has to get it up in front of people and give the right answer. I was asking as a human being, as a mom, what would I write? And the answer was that night, and I think it still holds true right now, is I don't think I have too wonderful fully written across my personal suffering. It's almost as if I have T-O-O and I've started work on the W. Because for me, this is a process with God and not a completion. And so I'm saying, God, would you help me learn to pick up my marker and keep working on too wonderful. That God, you are too wonderful. And he has been just so kind as I look back on my life, probably the last 12 years, that he was teaching me how to pick up a marker and write too wonderful before any suffering, before Adora existed. He knew what was coming and he was preparing me. I can see it so clearly. He was preparing me to learn how to, in the worst of suffering, write too wonderful. And I want to take you guys for about 5 or 6 minutes on that journey, what it looked like on the inside of my head for the last 12 years or so, for him to do that with me. Now, I've been a girl who has always loved physical science. And I've always been fascinated with blue whales. Now, a blue whale is the largest creature on Earth. Now, that includes, it's the largest creature they believe has ever existed. That includes dinosaurs. It is larger, and it's still living, larger than anything else. And it's hard for us to get proportions on here correct, to see how large this fish is. Now, its tongue is the size of an elephant. It weighs as much as an elephant does. Its tongue. As a baby, it gains 200 pounds a day. You thought you had a big baby. Their hearts on the inside of them are as large as a small car. And a child could swim through their veins. Their veins are that large. That is a massive creature. Now, that creature lives in an ocean. And this ocean is so big that that whale is like a speck of sand on the tip of my finger. Just a speck. That massive whale amongst all this water is just a speck of sand. Now we look at this water, and the earth is covered, and about 70% of the earth is covered with water. We've explored, we know what's in about 1% of all the waters on Earth. 1%. Scientists think there's probably millions, if not more, whole species that we have no idea exist because we know so little. It is a massive amount of water. There are mountain ranges under this water that are higher than Mount Everest, and they don't even touch the surface of the water. The water at its deepest point goes 7 miles down into the abyss, where it is pitch black. It is so deep, it is so dark, with these magnificent creatures that live there. The water on the earth is unbelievably massive. But it is nothing when compared with our sun. That water sits on the tip of my finger like a grain of sand. All that water, all those mountain ranges, compared to the sun. Here we are, we're this little dot, and that is the sun. 1 million Earths with all that water, 1 million of them can fit inside the sun. But the sun is just like a grain of sand on the tip of my finger compared to our Milky Way galaxy. And this is a mock-up that somebody has done. We can't get far enough out of our galaxy to take a picture of it. This is what they believe our galaxy looks like. Now, that doesn't look, it looks like a bunch of white dots. What we can't see is how massive this is. Now, if you and I wanted to take a journey and we wanted to go from this side of the Milky Way all the way to the end, we could all load up on a bus, but we'd have to travel at the speed of light. Now let's think about how fast light travels. It's 186,000 miles per second. Now, that's hard for our minds to even register. So let's think about it this way. We have the Earth, which we already said is very large. Light can travel 7 times around the Earth in the snap of my finger. That's 186,000 miles per second. 7 times around the Earth at the snap of my finger. Now, we would have to travel at the speed of light to get from here to here. No potty breaks, we're not stopping, nobody's getting gas. We've just got to make our way across our galaxy. It would take us over 100,000 years traveling at the speed of light. That's mind-blowing. Now, here's the thing. Our galaxy, the Milky Way, is nothing but a grain of sand on the tip of my finger compared to the billions upon billions of galaxies that are just as big as ours. Now, what Isaiah the prophet says is that God, when he wants to measure the universe, he takes his hand, and from the tip of his thumb and to the tip of his pinky, he reaches across all those hundreds of billions of galaxies without even stretching and says, yep, it's about that big. He sets that far above, with that much grandeur and power. And then Isaiah says, all that water that we see, it's just like a little puddle in the palm of his hand. Not one piece of water drips out, nothing. It just stays right as a puddle in the palm of his hand. Yet in that same chapter, Isaiah says, he cares for you like a shepherd to his sheep. He carries you close to his heart. He is not just a God that is large and powerful. He is a God that is near and close. He not only knows your name, he knows the day you were born. He knows all the thoughts in between. He knows the day you will die. And he not only knows it, he cares. That is too wonderful. That knowledge of who he is too wonderful. It is tempting to buy the lie that we deserve answers. Our problem is these things that are happening to me in my life. The solution is, God, come make it better. And I think God is saying, not just to Job, but to us, the problem is you need to know who I am. The solution is staring up at the wonder of him and being able to learn how to write through our life too wonderful. God, you are too wonderful over any suffering we experience. In the epilogue of the book of Job, we see that Job, not only his body is healed, not only does he get all of his wealth back, he gets twice as much as what he had before, and he fathers 10 more children. He lives to a ripe old age. But that epilogue, that is not the point of the book, and it is not the climax of the book. When Job picked up a pen and wrote too wonderful over his suffering, that was the climax. Until God comes and reveals himself to Job, that was the point that everything changed, even when Job's circumstances remained the same. Everything changed because Job saw God's glory. And I have longed, and I believe it's a longing that God has placed. I can't tell you how deep it is on the inside of me that you, through this study, have caught just a glimpse more of who he is, just a glimpse. And that in that glimpse, it would be a marker moment for you in ways that change the way you see and think about God. My prayer has been, as the lights go out, when the road is dark and steep, that what you have learned in the pages of the book of Job through God's word would be what come back to you. And what I mean by come back to you, I mean in 6 months, or for some of you, it may be 18 years, or for some of you, it may be 35 years, when the lights go out and the road is steep, that God would be kind enough to you and to me to bring back a remembrance of who he is in our suffering. Because here's what we want. We want to be women who deeply desire to be seeking God, growing in our understanding of who he is, looking for him in our personal story, looking for his plan in our personal story, so that we will trust and worship God in all circumstances. And I pray that we are on that road together, and that would be true for us. And so I love you guys with much affection, and praying that God has spoken to you, believing that he has, because it's his word, and he is faithful to that. And so it is with much love that we will keep praying for you guys as you continue your journeys. So God, I come grateful and thankful and in awe of who you are, that you are a God that is too wonderful, no matter what is written on our timeline of our life of suffering, no matter what the loss, no matter what the pain, you still remain the same. Yesterday, today, and forever, you are God. Equip us and teach us to love you and to worship you through anything. And it is with deep love for you, God, deep desire to make your name known, that I just in faith just sort of lay all these sessions at your feet and say, take it, God, for your glory, for your name. Change us, mold us to look more like you. And I pray this in Christ. Amen.